So yeah, this lady or bloke, not sure really, they're going to be a ginger. Hello and welcome to painting Kings of War 2-player starter set, Shadows in the North, Part 4, Clansmen and Hunters. This episode will have a heavy focus on painting cloth and leathers, mainly using contrast paints and inks to get some good natural tones. If you've seen the other videos in this series, the cleanup and the preparation before painting will be pretty similar. These hard plastic miniatures by Mantic do need a bit of scraping to get rid of mould lines. I think it's definitely worth removing the mould lines. Also, these guys are actually quite big. You can't easily fit 10 of them on a troop size unit base, as you can see there. So with the minimum model count, I'm kind of working on getting 8 of these guys on a troop base. I think they fit quite nice. They still seem quite packed in, you know, like a good unit size. Saves me painting 4 of these guys. So get through the job a bit quicker. That's a nice shot there, everything you get in the starter set. I've pinned these models to make them easier to batch paint, and you can see how I went about that in one of the other videos in the series, the scarecrows or the spectres. So I've undercoated these guys with German red-brown Vallejo surface primer. It's a real nice deep red-brown undercoat. Then I've sprayed them from above a really quite heavy zenithal highlight with white ink. So when you're looking at the model here on the screen, it actually does look quite light. If you to look at the underside of the model, it's actually quite dark. Using a white paint with a downward stroke on the dry brush here to bring out the edges of the model. We need the edges to be quite white so that the heavy glaze that we apply with contrast paints and inks works really well. Using some snakebite leather here from Games Workshop, going to mix that with 2 different inks from Scale 75 Intensity range. Going to use some red ink here, which will make a really sort of orangey leather colour, and then some chestnut ink, which will be, well, more chestnut really. A little bit browner, a bit warmer. You can see the difference there. Maybe warmer isn't quite the right phrase. It's but a little bit more chestnutty than orangey. Just pop in a different in contrast paints on the palette here. So we've got some wildwood and snakebite leather. We're starting with Guilliman flesh though, so we're going to paint all the skin really with Guilliman flesh. It's not as heavily pigmented as some of the others, like the snakebite leather for example, so you might want 2 coats if you're wanting a deeper skin tone, but I'm quite happy with one fairly heavy coat to start with on these guys. Using a big size 6 brush here, totally fine for the contrast paints. Do need to be a little bit careful that we don't get them pooling all over the place. Using the brush to kind of guide the paint onto the model rather than painting it. You can see here I'm just checking which way my brush is fish hooking a little bit. It doesn't matter that there's a fish hook on the end of the bristles on this synthetic brush. As long as you know which way it points, you can then use it to move the paint around on the model. So where I don't want it to go on the sword basically, and I don't want it to go on the cuffs of the jacket that this guy's wearing. But like I said, if you know which way the brush is fish hooking, you'll know which way the paint is going to flow off the brush. Going in with some of this like orangey leather colour now. You can see that the red ink is really deepened the snakebite leather towards the orange tones. I really quite enjoy painting with the contrast paints. I know Games Workshop sell these as kind of like beginner friendly, and they are. But you do have to put them on quite carefully, and it's just quite fun the way the paint flows off the brush. Like I said, I enjoy painting with them. Speeding this up now because although it's meant to be an easy, quick approach, it does take time to just put the paint on carefully. Straight snakebite leather here, really like this colour. as I'm painting this guy, I haven't edited out the small mistakes that I make. See there, I'm just wiping a bit off with my thumb. And I'd initially thought I'll paint the straps a little bit of a different colour to the main leather part of this sort of vest that this guy's wearing. In the end, I decide, as you'll see in a minute, I'm just going to paint over the whole of the vest, including the straps with the snakebite leather. It's meant to be a fairly quick paint job to look good on the tabletop, but not spent absolutely ages. The contrast paints over the zenithal highlight really work well as a kind of one coat job on most of the model. I will provide some highlights on this guy a bit later, but not over everything. The zenithal undercoat that we put on to start with does the job well enough. You can see there I've got a wet brush sitting on the side that I'll use to take off any paint that's sort of gone astray. How I approached speed painting the whole unit was to start with a colour, put it on, say, the main vest or the trousers in this case, and then pick out a second colour, so in this case the snakebite leather, and apply it to another part of the model. And then to balance it out, I would then use the same colour somewhere else on the model. So this guy's got the vest painted, so I'll use the same colour, that, i.e. the snakebite leather, on the wraps here around the bottom of the boots. They're kind of holding on some, they're sort of like straps that hold on some bones on the front of the model. I'll then leave a space, so you've got some like ruffles there on the guy's forearm, but I'll paint the straps on the wrist. So we'll go back in with a different colour to break up the snakebite leather. I just used some of the red colour off the trousers on the hood, so again it's sort of using the same colour on the model but separating it a little bit so it's not the same colour on two pieces of cloth right next to each other. Just straight up wildwood on the boots here. One thing you do need to be careful of with these contrast paints is they're very thin, so on the feet here in particular, if I was to then, once it's dried, if I was then to grab the model around the feet, your fingers are quite likely to start pulling that paint off more so than if it was a normal opaque paint. So about halfway, or not halfway through, sort of as I got through painting these guys, I did put a little bit of varnish, satin varnish over the whole model just to keep everything sealed in. Another example here of using the same colour in a few different places, just using the wildwood on the handle of the sword. Going to paint those sticks on the guy's back as well. They sticks there, spare javelins. So I start off with the contrast paint, being a little bit careful, trying to paint just the wooden javelins. Then afterwards I think it's not worth it. I'm just going to paint the whole lot in the wildwood. The zenithal highlight will give some definition to the different elements. It's not maybe the best way to do it. If you wanted to spend more time, you could pick out the straps in a different colour. Bit of a test here, adding in a bit more of the red into the snakebite leather and red ink mix. Probably a bit of a mistake. I didn't use this very orangey colour on many of the models, but again, I didn't want to edit it out. I just sort of show you guys what it looks like. It's quite a nice colour. It just doesn't quite work. It's too red, in my opinion. You might like it. Let me know if, what you think. It just seems a little bit too unnatural, but I left it in just to sort of show you what it's like. And we're trying to have some variety across the unit. It's perfectly reasonable to think that a bunch of guys from the northern wastes would have, different coloured clothing. So yes, it's looking pretty good so far. Straight up skeleton horde now on all the edges of the elements of what I would have thought would have been fur. So really like this contrast paint, and it's really easy to go on. It's a little bit thinner than some of the others, less pigmented. Obviously it's designed for painting bone, but it's actually great for fur as long as you highlight the, as long as you highlight it afterwards with something like an ivory, which we'll do a little bit later. I had in my mind when I started painting these guys, as soon as I put this skeleton horde on, I really liked the way it looked as a colour for the fur, and it made me think that this part of the model, or all the fur parts that is, are going to be something of a standout point on the models where I spend a little bit more time highlighting and shading them rather than some of the larger areas like the vests and the trousers, where the contrast paint kind of does that job for you. The contrast paint does that job for you on the fur as well, but you'll see later what I mean and where I think it's worth spending the extra time on the fur. Also using that skeleton horde just to paint the bone elements. Makes sense, right? It's a really nice colour to sort of tie together some of the rest of the model. It doesn't stand out so much like the orange. I think part of the reason why I don't like that orange so much on the tabby type thing is that it's too close in colour, but not quite the same as the trousers, so it just doesn't quite look right. But like I said, I'm going to leave it in because we got, 16 of these guys. Doesn't matter if one of them's colour, one of the tabbers doesn't look quite right to me. It's fine. Painting these big elk horns with the skeleton horde as well. Again, not fussed too much if the straps that are holding them together are painted in the same colour. It's kind of how I'm approaching this whole project, is to get them done, get them on the tabletop. If I want to go back in later and change that colour, maybe paint those straps with something like Games Workshop Rackar Flesh, for example, I can do it at a later date. You can really see on the shield there the way the contrast paint works, sort of flowing into the recesses. Really great as a quick way of painting shade. Wanted something to make the belt stand out a little bit, and so rather than going for another warm, dark brown colour, for example, I could have put the wildwood on here, but I thought I'll use the black templar, provide a bit of definition between the top and the bottom half of the model. And because we're using the contrast paints, it's not like it's a completely solid black, it's more a kind of a dark grey leather look sort of colour. Yeah, I think it works fine. Trying to be a bit careful though, because we don't want that black ink to start seeping into the other parts of the model, that some of which are still wet. You can see here, even with the contrast paint being quite runny, and using a big brush, as long as the brush has got a pretty good tip on it and you're careful, haven't completely saturated the brush, you can still provide quite a lot of control when applying these paints. Still with the black templar, just undercoating all the areas that are going to be turned into steel. Just being careful not to get it on the bone areas, because that's not going to come off very well. I'm saying that, you could get it off if you were really quick with a wet brush. Just if it goes over some of the bone areas and I don't notice it, that black is going to ruin them. I'm calling this guy a guy, but when I painted these, I was thinking this was actually a woman, and I thought I quite fancy this person having red hair, so using some of the Game Ink skin wash. It's quite similar to the colour you get mixing the snakebite leather with the red ink, but not quite exactly the same. So yeah, this lady or bloke, not sure really, they're going to be a ginger. Putting a couple of coats on to make it quite intense. So some of these models have got what I assumed, well, what I painted is like a polar bear skin head type thing. So using a bit of the blue ink there, very thinned down, just to provide a bit of contrast to the warm colours. Yeah, there you go. Just an idea of how some of these guys are starting to look at the moment. You could leave them at this stage if you're happy with the finish that you've got so far. With the zenithal undercoat and the contrast paints, there is some highlighting and some shading already on the models. They probably look pretty good based up. I want to highlight the skin and the fur areas in particular, so I think these will be worth the extra time to make the models stand out. I'm using a similar approach that I've done previously in this series, mixing in some opaque paint with the contrast that makes up the base layer, if you will. So mixing in some elfic flesh and then some white into the Guilliman flesh contrast paint. It does a couple of things. It lightens it while keeping the same kind of tones, but it also thickens the paint up a little bit. It makes a real nice consistency for highlights. I'm really going to just glaze in the lighter colours now. You can see I'm sort of drawing the brush from it's like a mid-tone area towards where the highlight would be. The brush comes off the model on the area where I want the highlight to be, so kind of your classic glazing where you kind of drag the paint a little bit to the area where you want it to sit. You can see when I run it on my thumb there how thick it is, or the consistency of it. It's quite thin, there's not a huge amount on the brush. It needs a few passes of the glaze to really start to show through on the model. This brush hasn't got the finest point, but it's kind of okay for the job at hand here. Just highlighting the areas like the upper cheeks, the nose, centre of the forehead, chin, and slightly off centre highlighting the lips. I don't want the lips to stand out too much because it looks a little bit weird. Just about taking time really. So far I'm just using the mix of the Guilliman flesh and the elfic flesh. Gonna use exactly the same technique on the fingers. Not painting along the whole of the finger, concentrating mainly towards the knuckles. You can see I'm putting near enough all these highlights only on the facing edge or the top edge of the area that I'm highlighting. So on these knuckles it's all across the front and the top of the knuckles. If you were to look at the model from underneath you wouldn't see the highlights at all, it would be a lot darker. Just going to carry on with a few more glazes here. Going in now with the mix that used the white paint, so going to be a little bit lighter, just being a bit more selective with where I'm putting it. Leaving some of the previous glaze on the model and just adding a little bit more highlight. I don't mind that these clansmen and hunters have got a quite pale skin. I imagine that that's kind of what they'd be like from up in the northern wastes. Using the Guilliman flesh now straight out the pot, just not too much on the brush, just to sort of glaze in some bit more depth into the shadows. I think the skin is one area where it is worth spending a little bit more time just to get a nice smooth finish. Something I'll skip, for example, is painting the eyes. I think for a multi-base model I don't need to paint the eyes, but if at first glance the skin looks smooth and well shaded and well highlighted, I think that's half the job done. I can't remember what the old saying was, something like faces, shields and dragons, those are the things to focus on. Your centerpiece models, shields because they've usually got heraldry or something on them, and faces, highlight the areas that are going to make the most impact. Here's another one of the models, just quickly going through and showing the highlighting process again on one of the guys that wasn't quite as well highlighted with the zenithal undercoat. So the initial skin tone was a little bit darker than the first model that I was highlighting just now. This guy actually has a little bit more contrast about the whole model, and that's a good indication of needing to pay attention really to how you're undercoating the model to start with. It's kind of why Games Workshop suggests that you undercoat the whole model in one of their specific undercoats. Firstly, it provides a nice smooth base layer really to put the contrast paints on top of, but it also makes them pop really quickly. So like with this guy here, for example, you kind of do need to go in and put some highlights on because the original undercoat that the contrast paint went on top of wasn't super light. Here I'm using the slightly warm white mix. So that's the Gilliman Flesh with a little bit extra white added in, just to give some highlights on the cool polar bear skull thing that he's wearing on his head. I think the sculpt on this looks really good with the polar bear head, so wanted to take a bit more time on it. Hopefully it shows in the video, but you can just about see a tiny little bit of a blue tint to it where we glazed in some of the blue ink really well thinned earlier. Just using some straight thinned down white here. I say thinned down, it's actually the Vallejo Game Air white, so it's already quite thin. Looking at the back of the polar bear head there, you can really see how the zenithal approach that we took, the zenithal base layer, does a lot of the work for us. There's a slightly red undertone to the shadows there. So when we're highlighting with the pure white, which is obviously a cold colour, and the blue glaze is quite cold, there's a real nice contrast between the slightly warm shadows underneath and the cool highlights without a huge amount of work, to be honest. Yeah, I think that guy looks really good. I think the highlights really work well on the face. Back to the model here that I started with. Doesn't look as good as the other chap, I don't think. It's partly because the polar bear head looks really cool, and partly I'm just not sold on not really sold on that red tabard. Highlighting the fur here. Just picking out some of the strands. Some of the fur isn't particularly well sculpted. You can see that around the back of, like, so over the shoulder, around the back of the neck there. So we're going to add a little bit of texture using this highlight colour. Adding a bit of texture where there isn't really that much sculpted in. Focusing these highlights on the top of the fur elements, going nowhere near the underside of them. If you look at the fur around the neck, it's kind of cylindrical, so the top of it would be well highlighted and the underside would be well shaded. We'll go back in and shade the undersides of it a little bit later. Using the side of the brush a little bit there, just to pick out the top of those fur elements. See, there's a lot more work going into, say, these fur parts than, say, for example, the shield, and I'm totally fine with that. I think that the fur elements frame the model, they frame the face in particular, because all of them have got some fur around their necks. Using some straight ivory here just to give an almost sort of final highlight on some of these fur strands. Just picking out individual ones in the same way that you might highlight hair. Don't want to paint all of it with the highlight colour. It makes sense that kind of a natural fur would actually be, it would have some contrast in the colours. It wouldn't all be highlighted the same. Mix a little bit more of the dead white in, just in some areas. adds more interest to the model. Again though, I'm really only highlighting the fur, not particularly highlighting any of the bone areas. So straight skeleton horde now onto the undersides of all those cylindrical fur areas. Really gives some depth to the model and kind of accentuates the zenithal base coat that we put on right at the start. Using some of the skeleton horde there to add some shadow underneath the lip of the hood. You can kind of see the effect I'm going for here. If we had more time, we wanted to paint these to a higher standard, we could kind of take the same approach on other aspects of the model, but I'm happy to do it just on the fur. Yeah, I think these guys came out really well. So one of the things you'll notice in here is I lost the footage where I painted the metals. So the metallic areas are really just painted in the same way that I did the metallic on the spectres, and they've also got some stone axes and some like this guy here has got some like a stone spear. Those are painted with Incubi Darkness and highlighted with Dark Reaper to give a kind of a bluey green colour. Bit of a mess up there losing that footage because, you know, I quite like the stone effect. I'll redo it if there's some interest and people really want to see it. I'll redo it, but it's pretty straightforward. I think, you know, just using a few contrast paints and some inks, we get a real nice mix of warm leathery tones, some bone colour. I did highlight some of the bones a little bit with a similar method really to the fur, just using a mixture of like elfic flesh and ivory. The beards are highlighted in the same way as the polar bear heads. Yeah, ranked up, I think these guys look pretty cool. They're going to look really good when they're multi-based. Not a huge amount of effort, I don't know, probably about half an hour per model, maybe a little bit less when you're production lining them. I think the highlights on the fur, in my opinion, are really worth it. You know, faces, the fur, a little bit of highlighting on the hair. I think it works really well. Here's some of the hunters with javelins. Even at this point, I haven't actually played a game. My idea is to get this whole starter set finished, and then I'll play a game. It's one of my motivational techniques for actually finishing the project. If you like these videos, give us a subscribe and give us a thumbs up maybe if you liked it. If there are things that you didn't really like, leave a comment. Let me know why not. You know, I'm keen to improve these videos. If you've got some ideas about what you'd like to see, you know, let me know.